Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm a member of ASA. Are you a member of ASA? If you're not, you should be. Membership is just $50 Australian. ASA holds the biannual conference for animal studies scholars in the region, and next year, 2019, it's going to be hosted by the fabulous Annie Potts over in New Zealand. The call for papers is out at the moment, so if you want to come to the ASA 2019 conference, start thinking about your abstract and start thinking about submitting it. So that's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from Sydney town. It's quite a grey old evening here in Sydney town, and we're not at my place. We're actually recording very close to my place, but I'm actually at a hotel because I'm very, very lucky to be joined by an international guest. Now, Claire Parkinson is Professor of Film, Television and Digital Media, and also the co-director of the Centre for Humanimal Studies at Edge Hill University. And Claire is in Sydney to deliver a keynote address at a conference, so I'm very, very lucky to be able to grab a quick 30 minutes with her. If you can hear some background noise, that's because we're in the hotel lobby recording this episode, so it's all very real. So this week we're going to discuss Claire's book chapter, Dangerous Dogs and the Construction of Risk, and it appeared in the 2011 book, Humanimal Studies, Theorizing Animals, Rethinking Humanimal Relations, which was edited by Nik Taylor and Tania Signal and published by Brill. So welcome to the podcast, Claire.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
So Claire, can you start by telling us why you wrote this chapter?
Well, we have to go quite a long way back. In the 1980s, I'm going to go all the way back to the 80s.
Oh, yes, I love the 80s.
I was actually a commercial photographer at that point, and I was photographing dogs in rescue centres. And as things were starting to reach kind of a head in the tabloid press around these issues around pit bulls and this whole idea around dangerous dogs, I became quite heavily involved in that, and I started campaigning. And one of the things that I did, I was, working as a commercial photographer, and I had a photography exhibition called D is for Dog, which was about the changes in canine human stereotypes. And as I say, I got quite heavily involved in the campaign against breed-specific legislation in the UK. And then when I started working in academia, which was around 1995, I was still sort of really interested and I was still involved in that area. And as time went on, it was something that I wanted to go back to. It was something that I'd always still retained links with, and unfortunately breed-specific legislation wasn't going away, which was obviously again it was something that I was very much opposed to, and so one of the things I did was I decided I was going to write something about this, and I went back to all the old materials that I had. I'd actually written some things, radio pieces, sort of various different things, some press stuff as well, and I went back to all my old materials, and that's when I started kind of doing the research for this particular piece, and then went and did a lot of the archival research, all the old the newspapers, looking through those, and starting to sort of piece together this bigger narrative of what led up to the Dangerous Dogs Act. And I suppose it's one of the reasons, again, when you were asking me to think about something for us to talk about, one of the reasons that I actually wanted to talk about this again is that I've gone back to looking at breed-specific legislation again. There's a parliamentary inquiry at the moment going on in the UK. It's happening right now. They're right in the middle of it. They're just doing the second oral evidence session at the moment, and the inquiry is looking at whether breed-specific legislation has worked, whether it's actually protected the public, and it's very, very clear that it hasn't. And so one of the things that I did when they did the call for written evidence for the inquiry, I put forward a piece which was based on the research that I'd done. So it's something that I've returned back to again, and I'm doing another conference paper about it later in the year. So it's actually been quite timely, and it's been interesting for me to go back and look at that work from that I did sort of in the 2000s, so 2011, actually slightly earlier than that when I'd actually started doing the work, to go back to that and start bringing it up to date now.
Wonderful. So can you start by telling us what breed-specific legislation is?
So this was introduced in 1991 in the UK, and it was a piece of legislation that specifically targeted in the UK 4 breeds. In actual fact, it was targeting dogs that were known as pit bull terriers. The other 3 breeds that it talks about were not actually in the UK at that point. So this was really a piece of legislation which was about trying to eradicate dogs known as pit bull terriers from the UK. So breed-specific legislation, BSL, was really just about targeting one particular type of dog based on how those dogs look. Unfortunately, this was very much a piece of legislation that was a knee-jerk reaction to a moral panic that was happening in the UK at the time, which was absolutely constructed by the tabloid press.
So you mentioned quite a few of the issues that I wanted to speak to. Can you start by telling us what you mean by moral panic?
Okay, so there's obviously some theory around moral panics, and the idea is that there is a kind of a panic that begins to focus usually on an imagined community, and the questions that arise are always sort of moral in nature, and they concern essentially demonizing a particular group, but it's usually a reflection of wider social anxieties, but they're pinned onto one particular group. And in this case, the moral panic was around pit bull terriers and their owners, and it occurs at a point where the UK was going through a whole series of changes. It was still in an economic recession. There was supposedly higher rates of drug use. There were concerns still over the sort of Americanization of British culture. There were a whole series of different things that were going on. And what I think you find is that it becomes crystallized around this problem, this imagined, I'm going to say a sort of like imagined community of dog owners, which were the pit bull terrier owners. And this really comes out of press coverage, which often emphasized that, for example, pit bull terriers were the type of dog of choice of drug dealers, and every time there was a big drug raid and it was in the tabloid press, there would be some mention of, in the pit bull terrier, and pit bull terrier owners were often labelled as kind of brutal, and there becomes this sort of, as I say, this kind of crystallization around of a whole constellation of different concerns, but they really crystallize around the pit bull terrier and the pit bull terrier owners, and that's what becomes targeted. Now, that's not to take away from the fact that absolutely there were dog attacks happening. And they were becoming very high profile, and clearly, some of them, particularly those ones on children, got a lot of press attention. One of the issues, though, is that the dog attacks that were happening were not necessarily pit bull terrier attacks. There were a whole range of different breeds that were involved in these attacks, but pit bull terriers were, in a sense, they were a kind of easy target, and one of the reasons was because the other breeds of dog, they had the kind of the might, if you like, of the UK Kennel Club behind them. And it's interesting, I think, when you look at the numbers of attacks, the way that they were represented in the press, and the focus that you get on pit bulls, which really does sort of pulls focus away from the other breeds or the other issues. And so, for example, there were maybe there were sort of like stories certainly in the press around attacks on postal workers, for example, but some of them were treated almost as comedies, sort of like comedy stories, comedy narratives, because they would be small breeds of dog, and there would be sort of like the joke around, oh, this is a small breed of dog and it's biting and so on. But this was kind of like taken as sort of having some humor around it. And then you would have things like Rottweiler stories and pit bull terrier stories, and those would be the kind of the devil dog stories. The owners would always be young men. They would always be associated with drug culture or violence in some way, and so you start to get this emergence of a very clear narrative around dangerous dogs. It comes out of the tabloid press. But the problem, in a sense, for the UK government at the time was that if they had tried to ban Rottweilers, for example, there would have been a huge kickback from the UK Kennel Club and, Rottweiler owners and so on. And because they were what was classed as a recognised breed, whereas pit bull terriers were not a recognised breed, there was going to be much more of a kind of a kickback from owners and from the UK Kennel Club. So the pit bulls became the easy target, and there was the focus by the press, and then obviously the UK government, at the time said, well, in a sense, they were easy. And the Secretary of State, there's a really sort of interesting quote, which is in his autobiography. And he says that at the time he was really concerned around trying to ban any other breeds, because he said it would have, and this is a quote, infuriated the Green Welly Brigade. Essentially, it would have infuriated the middle classes. And he says, but it was fine because the pit bull terrier owners came to my rescue, appearing, on camera and talking about they were sporting tattoos and earrings, and talking about their dogs who were had names like Gripper and Sykes and Tyson, and so he actually admits in his autobiography that they were an easy target, and it would have been very difficult to have banned any other breeds. So this was a way that the legislation comes out of a very sort of problematic discourse that emerges from this moral panic around, violence, drug culture, and the associations with the pit bull terrier.
As you note in your chapter, that type of legislation was exported from the UK to other parts of the world, and Australia is certainly very enthusiastic about modelling a lot of its public policy on what happens in the UK. My observation in Australia is that a kind of dangerous dog or breed-specific legislation has resulted in a lot of debates about what constitutes a particular type of dog. How did it play out in the UK?
So there was, and this is what's really fascinating, is the way in which the legislation then has to be put, in a sense, into kind of action on the ground. And you get the guidance around how to identify a pit bull type. If you have a look at the information and the guidance that's provided by the department, DEFRA, the department that's responsible for overseeing this piece of legislation, it's a series of bullet points which describe what a pit bull type should be. And you realise fairly quickly that this could be applied to pretty much any dog, and if you cross, it's well known that if you cross a Labrador with a Staffordshire Bull Terrier, you will get probably a dog that fits this, this idea of a pit bull type. This is one of the ones that's constantly kind of brought up as an example. So it's a real issue because, first of all, you have a completely ambiguous set of criteria. Then you have the people who are experts who then have to apply these criteria. And of course, it's all based on a visual assessment of how a dog looks. It has absolutely no bearing, in terms of, how this dog behaves. It's purely about how the dog looks. So one of the things that's happened in terms of how this has played out is we have dogs who are being put to sleep because of the way that they look, and they are perfectly well-behaved, wonderful dogs who have been family, companions without any problem whatsoever, but purely because of how they look and their type, they're essentially being demonized and euthanized as a consequence.
So is the world a better place in any way, shape or form as a result of breed-specific legislation?
It absolutely is not. And one of the things that is very clear is that breed-specific legislation has been a catastrophic failure. If it's not the best guide, but if you have a look at the number of people who are being admitted to hospital for dog bites, that's increased year on year since the introduction of breed-specific legislation in the UK, with one dip. There is a point where it kind of dips down, but it continues to, the numbers continue to go up. The number of fatalities due to dog bites, again, is also increased. We're not seeing any benefit whatsoever. What we do see is a very costly piece of legislation that is not just in terms of the economic costs huge, because you have a very lengthy system to go through to actually get from seizing a dog to getting to the point where it's identified and then eventually put to sleep, and that can take months for that to happen. It's not just the economic cost, it's the cost in terms of what's happening to the dogs, and certainly in terms of welfare, those dogs who eventually are found not to be pit bull types, they've had to spend days, weeks, months, quite often, in kennels. There's certainly plenty of cases of dogs who have absolutely no human contact during that time. There's certainly cases that have been reported. And the cost as well to families who have their dogs just taken away from them because of the way that they look, only to be returned to them months later after the family and the dog have gone through really a horrendous time, and it's been incredibly costly as well, to the taxpayer. At every level, this is an absolute abject failure, this piece of legislation. And quite honestly, there isn't a different story to tell wherever you look around the world. And in fact, what we're seeing now is that where breed-specific legislation has been introduced, there are a few countries now that are repealing that legislation. There's areas in Germany where the legislation's been repealed because it's been found to be a failure.
Do you think the UK will repeal it?
Well, I am very, very hopeful that'll be the case. So the inquiry is going on at the moment, and they are just going through a second round of oral evidence. And the evidence, I would say, is so strongly stacked in favour of repealing the legislation that it would be foolhardy, surely, to do anything else. But it was completely foolhardy to introduce it in the first place. So I would hope that that's what will happen, that the inquiry will find that the weight of evidence is such that it is sensible to repeal, and that's what I'm hoping for at the moment. Yes.
Has the air of moral panic retreated a little bit, or is the media perhaps behaving itself a little bit better with regards to this issue?
I would say that there is nothing like the sort of moral panic that there was. However, what you do find is every now and again, especially if it's a story of a child or a vulnerable person being attacked, you do get this sort of quick frenzy again around, the concern around dangerous dogs. But I would say on the whole, there is more backing now to get rid of this piece of legislation. And the big turnaround as well has been some of the key organisations. So when it was initially introduced, the UK Kennel Club actually didn't have anything to say about it. They had no interest in it. As I say, the pit bull type was not recognised by the UK Kennel Club as a breed. So at best, they were neutral, but actually there was, in some senses, they were actually for this piece of legislation being introduced, and there are some statements from people in the Kennel Club that were pro breed specific legislation at the time. There's been a big change of heart now, and part of that has been because people with Staffordshire Bull Terriers, which they are a recognised breed, recognised by the UK Kennel Club. These are people who've been targeted by breed-specific legislation, and so they're people who are having to prove that their dogs are not pit bull types. And so you've got now some backing from the UK Kennel Club, and they are obviously supporting a repeal of the legislation, but the big welfare organisations are behind getting rid of the legislation as well. So the RSPCA, for example, Dogs Trust. So you've got some of the, let's say, big hitters who are in there now, who are obviously giving evidence to the inquiry. And I would say that, they obviously carry a lot of weight. At the time when breed-specific legislation was being introduced and was being tabled, what you had was the tabloid press week by week having a story about, a pit bull, supposedly pit bull type, and, the terrible owners, and images of the of someone being who's been attacked in hospital, and you didn't actually get, there were no opportunities for people who lived with pit bull terriers to actually have a voice in that debate, and so what you find is that the voices of the people who lived with pit bull terriers and knew what these dogs were like to live with, and that they were great, sort of family companions, obviously like any dog, brought up in the right environment. These are great family companions. So they didn't really get a voice in this at all, because they were all put into this one kind of group, this imagined community of dreadful, bad, dog owners. So the occasions where you do see people appearing in the mass media, they are very, very selective in terms of who they pick. So the people that they pick are, young men with kind of tattoos and earrings. Exactly, Secretary of State at the time actually talks about those were the people because they fitted what was, the stereotype at that moment of the pit bull owner. But if you look at some of the sort of more specialist dog magazines of the time, there were plenty of people who were writing in and they were talking about, here's a photograph of my wonderful pit bull, here she is, she's lovely, here she is with the kids, and there was plenty of evidence there. But these were in the specialist dog magazines, and they weren't sort of there in mass circulation.
The Daily
as obviously
Sun.
the tabloids were.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Claire, that's absolutely fascinating. That gives us something to focus on and to pay attention to. And perhaps if things change in the UK, your former colonies will follow suit. So, Claire, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am, yes.
Okay. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
This is really, really difficult. I can't remember for definite the first, but I can tell you sort of 4 pieces that I think were sort of around the first things. So Peter Singer's Animal Liberation for sure, and that might have been the first. But also I remember really vividly reading John Burge's Why Look at Animals. I was a commercial photographer, and actually I remember somebody giving that to me and saying, you must read this, this is an amazing piece, and I remember that. But I also remember reading Harriet Ritvo's The Animal Estate and Keith Thomas's Man in the Natural World. So I'm not entirely sure which order that happened in, but those 4 were kind of the first things that I remember reading.
Wonderful. All good choices. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
These are such difficult questions because, again, so I was writing about animals for press and media, but in terms of the first thing that I wrote that was published, which is probably easier for me to kind of pinpoint, that was a journal article which was published in 2001. And it was called Marking Territories, and it was about the kind of the boundaries of humanness and the boundaries of what it is to be properly human and properly animal, and the way in which sort of differences negotiated between these two, and the kind of essentially the cultural politics of that. So that was in 2001.
Wonderful. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
These are such difficult questions to answer. So I cannot really be pinned down to one. I'm so sorry. This is terrible.
A lot of people are very disobedient in relation to this question.
So, those people that I said, the first things that I read in the early days, certainly those were, I guess, the people who really influenced me because they were some of the first things that I read. But also, I read, Steve Baker's Picturing the Beast and Carol J. Adams. There's so much that's now come out of critical animal studies scholarship, which I think is so important. And I couldn't pick just one person there because I think, across the scholarship, it's fantastic. And it's so exciting, I think, to see this growing as a field. And for me as well, there's also eco-media scholarship, which there's a lot of people there who are very influential. But I think possibly right now, there's work that's being done on kind of care ethics and empathy, which for me has been quite exciting to read very recently. People like Laurie Gruen and Alyssa El Tola really kind of interesting work that's sort of influencing me, I guess, in terms of the shape and direction of my work at the moment.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Don't eat them. That's probably the first thing. I'm sure everyone says that. I think, us as academics, one of the things that we really need to be involved in is changing the conversation and challenging the norms that exist out there at the moment around animals. Actually being able to challenge those. But what we need to do is we need to get out of what I think can sometimes be quite inward looking. If you're involved in academia and scholarship, sometimes we can be quite inward looking and talk amongst ourselves, and we end up in these echo chambers. We actually need to be out there and maybe speaking at places and conferences and events that maybe are not quite within our sort of our comfort zone, but actually that's okay. I think we need to be engaging with academics who are outside of our disciplines, outside of our field. We need to be engaging with the public. I think the sort of knowledge exchange activities are really important, and where we can, obviously working with key decision makers, policy makers, other organisations. It would be great if we had, sort of wonderful power as academics to, engage with all of these different groups. But I think where and when we can, we should be doing that. So, first of all, don't eat animals, and then secondly, where we can, get out there and, actually talk to people, but try not to be too insular. Wonderful.
So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
It's probably pretty clear what I just said. I think that the main thing would be around reducing harm and sort of to foster relationships that are built on care and empathy. Relationships that acknowledge the sentience of others and also kind of happily embrace species difference. So I guess that would be it.
Fantastic. So what are you working on next?
So at the moment I'm just finishing off a book. Actually, I've just finished a book on anthropomorphism, which I hope will be out next year. And I'm in the middle of a project with a colleague of mine, Richard Twine. He's the co-director with me. We're both co-directors of the Centre for Humanimal Studies, and we're working on a piece of funded research for the Vegan Society, and we're looking at how non-vegans perceive and understand vegans and veganism. So that work should finish by the end of this year, and hopefully we will be publishing something from that, and that work should be available sort of next year sometime.
Wonderful. And of course, Richard is a friend of this show. He's been on the podcast before.
I believe so, yes. He told me.
So I really look forward to that work. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, are you following us on Twitter? Have you left a review on iTunes? Do you know someone went on to iTunes and left a 1-star review for Knowing Animals? We better respond quickly with some 5-star reviews, people. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. So get reviewing, get subscribing, get tweeting, get Facebooking, and most of all, continue to know animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.